Salam, sabah al-noor, sabah al-khair. Okay, I'll switch to English. I was asked to just start this session slightly. I think we are very happy to be back. Now we're getting to the empirical side. Just for your information, I brought two books, if you want to pass that. One is the one I had mentioned about Fazlur Rahman, and the other one is a very simple book that I bought at bookstore of Agdel, La Librairie de l'Agdel, which is putting together kind of the new thinkers of Islam, and you might want to check who they are, and it's a simple introduction on each of them, their life and what they published and all that. And in there is Abdul Karim Surush and other people. And of course in footnotes, a distinguished professor, Filali Ansari, is mentioned, of course. So maybe you want to pass them to see them. Before we start, I just wanted to say one little thing. As an academic, or on your academic, if you put on your academic brain, I think the exercise that the professor is going to be presenting to us is very interesting, about looking at Islam as though, like a language, like Arabic, and then you have all these dialects. And at the core, it's Arabic. Like Omar Sharif, when they asked him what's an Arab, he answered, it's the one who listens to Kulthum. So there's a core, and then you have all these different Darija and local dialects. So in Islam, it seems you have maybe a core, there is, and then you have different ways of living Islam. What I will ask you, if I'm incorrect, Professor, you correct me, but this is a presentation of what there is. It's not judging the value or the legitimacy of what people do. I hope you understand. Do you see the difference, no? It's an academic work, so you look at the empirical evidence, and then you kind of label it, and you situate it within the map of Islam. It's not judging whether a Chinese, a Shia, like a XI, like a Hui, a Chinese Muslim, is more Muslim than somebody from Tarudant, because he does something else. All right? It's just a way of looking. But our tendency as Muslims is immediately to say, no, this is not Islam. The guy who says Allah Akbar and has a shot of vodka, Ya'idu billah. So it's very hard as an academic, Muslim academic sometimes, to differentiate between having an objective academic approach to what the reality is out there with what we think, or what we value as, what Islam should be. And remember that جعلناكم شعوبا, no? We have made you different tribes and different people, and you have to travel and see the world. And I will finish just by saying there's a hadith, or it's reported the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, ask the scholar, speak with the wise, and sit with the poor. So we're lucky that we can ask the scholar here today. So Professor Reinhart, thank you.
I'm sorry, raised in the suburbs of America, and that, like all religious traditions, it's localized, it has specific features. It's pretty bland, pretty unexciting. And my wife is an architectural historian, so she went, when she was a graduate student, to Italy. And they were going around to all of these great churches and villas and so on and so forth. And in church after church, they would go in, and there were these relics of the saints. And these relics were miraculous. And so the blood of the saints one day a year flows from one thing to another miraculously. In a lot of them, you have the arm, let's say, of St. Catherine, and it's just an arm that's like you take out of the grave. You know, there's a bone and there's flesh hanging off of it, and, you know, fingers and hands and a heart and all of this stuff. And it was shocking. And all of the other students knew that Marlene was a Roman Catholic, and they said, explain this to us. This is superstitious, you know, what's this about? And her answer was, I have no idea. I don't think this is Catholicism. This is just superstition. And of course, her professor, who was an Italian, said, look, all over Italy, all of these churches have all of these relics of saints. There have been relics of saints from the beginning. Who are you coming from suburban Texas to say this is not Catholicism, this is just superstition? Now, did her professor, when he had a cancerous growth on his arm, did he go to St. Catherine or did he go to the hospital? He went to the hospital, right? But the point to recognize here is that one of the characteristic features of modern religiosity is dealing with thinking about these particular fleshly, bodily features that we have largely pushed to the side, but that have been important, and for some people still are important in their own faith. But there's a general move to spiritualize religion, to make it something inside, in the head, make it private, right? That we have to recognize as a feature of our time. It's not necessarily a feature of religion in general. So with that in mind, you'll see the connection, I'm sure, as we go along, or you've already seen it. But I want to begin with the term Moroccan Islam. And the term Moroccan Islam, I had no idea, actually, you know, when I was here as a graduate student, or as an undergraduate student. We took a course on Moroccan Islam. A fellow named, a colleague of mine actually now at Dartmouth, Dale Eichelman, had just written a book called Moroccan Islam. And I took it for granted, Moroccan Islam. And when we talked to various Moroccans who were part of the program, they all to a person disliked this term, Moroccan Islam. There's only Islam, they said. Moroccan Islam is something that is used to divide Muslims. It's not true. And so one of the things that I did as I was thinking about this program was to look at the term Moroccan Islam, or better yet, Islam Moroccan, and look at its history. So the term doesn't appear in English until 1915, but it appears in French in 1885, it seems. Of course, interestingly enough, if you see this graphic, this is an engram. It's a record of looking at a huge corpus of French material, how often the phrase Islam Moroccan appears. And you'll see that just around 1900, but especially around 1905, the term Islam Moroccan takes off. Now, what happened around 1905 that would cause the term Islam Moroccan to become important? Any guesses? What happens around 1905 and the French and Morocco? Anybody? Right, the beginning of the taking over of Morocco by the French protectorate, right? So it's just, the term becomes prominent just as the French come on their colonial project to Morocco, okay? So the term clearly is connected conceptually, and it's found useful in the colonial enterprise. More, if you look at the classics of, I don't know if the bottom is showing there. It doesn't. If you look at the classics studies of Moroccan Islam, you'll see that a number of the great ones are written by people, George Stillman is a good example, who wrote under the name of Georges Drague. He was, in fact, a French colonial officer. And so it turns out that a lot of the information on Moroccan Islam was written by colonial officers whose interest was in the pacification, to use the polite word, of Morocco, especially in the Atlas regions and in the Rif. So it's clear to say that the French used the term Moroccan Islam partly to try and, we all know about the attempts to talk about Berber Islam and so on, and to create a Berber academy to separate, Moroccans into Berbers and Arabs and all that stuff. But this term Moroccan Islam was part of the colonial project. Now, here's where we're called upon to be, again, scholars and not journalists or ideologues. The term itself, I think, is actually quite a useful term. And the mistake is not to use the term Moroccan Islam. It's that we don't use the term enough Egyptian Islam, or Syrian Islam, or Arabian Islam, or Pakistani Islam, or Indian Islam, or whatever. In other words, the particularities of the practice of Islam, as we look at it as academicians, are an important feature. And we need always to recognize that if I'm blathering about Islam, and my experience with Islam, my experience where? My experience with whom? Right? Because, again, and I demonstrate this, I think, at considerable length in lived Islam, the fact is that Islam has particularities, that although the Egyptians think what they do is just Islam, and all scholars, Western scholars, think that what the Egyptians do is just Islam, and then somehow what they do in Morocco or Yemen is deviant. In fact, the Egyptian stuff itself is distinctively Egyptian. So, in other words, putting an adjective in front of the term Islam is not just, it can be used this way, but it is not about dividing Muslims up or suggesting that Islam is not a unity, right? Any more than to say that we have the state of New Hampshire and we have the state of Texas and we have the state of California doesn't mean that there is not a unity there, right? But as scholars, we have to notice that there are differences. Now, an objection to putting adjectives in front of the term Islam is to say, well, if it's true that there's a Moroccan Islam that we can kind of recognize and talk about, then also it must be true that we can follow that logic all the way down to, the level of Ahmed Fulan, who lives on number 12 Moulay Hassan Street on February 15th, 2022. And what is his Islam like? Because there's a sense in which the appropriation of religious life is done by individuals. So why not look at, well, the answer is simple. We cannot write the biography of, let's say, 80 million Egyptian Muslims, right? There's some value in aggregating. And it turns out that, particularly in the modern period, there's some value to noticing that there are distinctive Islams within national boundaries. Now, before the national state, there still were cultural entities, and we can talk about Morocco and going down to some extent toward Mauritania and so on and so forth as a cultural entity, and it's in conversation with a cultural entity that goes across to Tunisia. There's a break, Egypt. And that even breaks down because then we get tons of Maghrebis studying in Egypt and coming back and bringing Egyptian Arabic as well as Egyptian Islam back to Morocco. But the point is that the first objection to particularizing Islam is that it's a part of the colonial project, which undoubtedly it was, and B, that it implies that there is no Islam really. It's just Moroccan stuff and Egyptian stuff and so on. And that I want to push against in the same way that I would say the existence of Moroccan Arabic and Egyptian Arabic and Iraqi Arabic and so on doesn't disprove the idea that the term Arabic is useful. So that's a defensive note just before we get started, because these objections are raised, and they're raised cogently, intelligently. It is a real thing to be aware of when you put adjectives in front of the word Islam. You know, what use is being made with that, or what's being done with that adjective. So, what do we know about Moroccan Islam? Well, one of the unfortunate facts is that, I was asking somebody about this the other day, just in case I had missed it. We have a lot of accounts of Westerners, that is to say people from Iberia and from Morocco, who go east and write travelogues, and they tell us about, we learn a lot about Egyptian Islam and Syrian Islam and so on from these travelers who go east. Unfortunately, the East, even then as now, is incurious about the West of Islam. We don't have many accounts of Moroccan Islam by others from the outside to describe it for us. So we have to try and infer what's going on by looking at things like fatwas, by looking at criticisms by ulama of practices, by what we call reading against the grain. So in other words, if a better example is Ibn al-Hajj in Egypt, who some of you may know, when he writes saying, we have to stop women from doing these things, we know that women may be doing these things, because you don't write something, you don't see anybody criticizing, you know, I don't know what, Moroccans for eating, I don't know what, too many, Hostess Twinkies or something like that. No, they don't, because it's not here, right? They don't eat too much spotted dick or some British food. No, they don't do that. So if you criticize people, it's because they're doing this thing that you're criticizing them for. So that's called reading against the grain. And so we have some, you know, a good number of Moroccan texts, Fatawas, Waran Charisi is a good example, Nawazil literature and so on, that involve criticism to some extent of various practices that are happening. That tells us something. But it doesn't give us in any way a full picture, and it's really not until the 19th and 20th century with European ethnographers that we get a detailed picture. And particularly, of course, I'm referring to Edvard Westermark, who was a Swedish Finn who came here and amazingly, with a little team of people, wrote volumes and volumes and volumes describing the details of Moroccan life, including religious life. So, looking at the historical sources that we have, looking at the religious sources we have, looking at the ethnographic sources we have, one of the things we can say about Moroccan Islam is that there's a great deal of concern with place, with locale. There are places that are powerful and places that are sacred. Now, this idea of a place that is sacred is well known in religious studies, and the great Romanian student of religion, Mircea Eliade, points out that one of the things that religions in general do is create space that is heterogeneous. That is, most space is just homogeneous, it's all the same, right? So we look at a plain field and we just say, it's just the same old stuff. Or we look at a city and it's just apartments and And what religion does is it makes some places special, makes it heterogeneous, and that breaks up the context of the space and enriches parts of it, and, you know. So this is the difference, for those of you who've read Durkheim, between the sacred and the profane, right? The sacred is that which is set apart, right? Which is distinguished, which is differentiated. And in Morocco, the land itself had features, this is again not unique to Morocco by any means, but it had unique features that stood out on the landscape. It could be a tree where there are no other trees. It could be a spring, a valley, a cave, a high place, a mountain, right? And this was understood to be somehow set apart. This surely predates the Romans. But to the local imagination, those places seem pregnant with significance and power and grace. And so they come to be associated with persons who have significance and power and grace. And there are a number of interesting features about this in Morocco, but the overwhelming feature of the Moroccan religious landscape is the association of place with saint, right? With walis, or, aqtab, or autad, or any number of terms that are used for God's special friends. But we can see the priority of place over person in that many of these places are associated with a saint that they don't even bother to name. So there's, Saint Qada al-Haja, he takes care of things. Saint Maimun, right? Saint Good Luck, and so on. That's associated with a specific place. We don't know who this person is. There's no biography of this person. But there must have been a saint associated with that place, because place and sainthood, by the Middle Ages are associated with each other. But it must have been that the place was powerful, and then we have to attach a saint to it. So this seems to be a feature, and we have a number of these quite amusing, I think, places that are named after somebody. We don't know who he is, but he must have been here. But power itself is an important part of what we're thinking about when we think about a place in Morocco. And again, some places were powerful that weren't really places. So there are several really big canons in Morocco that were described to Westermarck as being holy places or effectively saints, because a big canon is a powerful object. So, although I'll get back to that in a bit. The fact is, though, that in Morocco, as all throughout the Mediterranean and probably throughout most of the world, there was, in addition to what we think of as, the religion of Morocco, which is to say Islam, there was also kind of another religion that Grahan has described in a book about Syria and Eastern Turkey as agrarian religion. Right? This is a religious life that's concerned with the particular concerns of peasants and farmers. It's concerned with who can make sure that there's rain, who can make sure that we don't have insects, right? But also with festivals associated with harvest, with planting, with midsummer, and so on and so forth. And because Morocco was Islamic, these events are a mashup connected to, they become Islamic, but they are the locus of people's concerns. So yes, fine, the Quran, that's great, but I'm really concerned about whether it's going to rain this year, right? Or, more personally, I'm really concerned about having a son, right? And so a woman who is, for whatever reason, including her husband's inabilities, is unable to have children, where's she to go? I mean, this is not something that is directly the kind of thing that the scholars in Fez are going to be able to help you with. And so it turns out that for the practical needs of persons, particularly in an agrarian, agricultural setting, these local figures are the locuses or the loci of power. And religion, among other things, is about power, about the ability to get things done, certainly in the pre-modern period. And so what we see then is that throughout Morocco, we have a whole series of places that are by themselves powerful, to whom saints are attached. We also, however, have, sorry, I'm just dragging behind here. We also have persons who are notable, who stand out. And this, again, is not only present in most religious traditions, but it is present in Islam. It is an uncontroversial doctrine in the early period, even among Hanbalis, that some persons are, either because of their own achievements or because of a random, you might say, choice by God, they are particularly, they stand out. And these are people that I'm just going to use this, a shorthand term for in English, and that's saints, although the concept is different from sanctity and sainthood in Christianity, of course, and there are many terms and many different understandings of it among Muslims. But the point is that even if you look at somebody like Ibn al-Jawzi, who is a Hanbali activist, who is a critic of many Sufi practices, he writes a book on, God's awliya. Right? So this is important for us as we think about the contemporary world as well. We'll talk about it more. Now, to return to the idea of place, one thing that's important about these places is that these places are local, and to some extent that excludes the universal. So, places of sanctity are places where it is religious control rather than other forms of social control or political control that are most powerful. And this means that these places can be a locus of emotion and emotional expression, right? One is supposed to be self-controlled. You don't just get emotional all the time. That's sort of impossible to do. But it's in sacred places that you can give way to emotion and that you see heightened expressions of emotion. It's places where you see religious creativity, right? Thinking in new ways about religion, thinking new thoughts about religion, right? Some of them, of course, what the establishment would call heresy or bid'ah. And they're also a place where suppressed groups can express themselves, right? And there are lots of groups that are subject to different kinds of social control, women, different ethnic groups, things like that, the poor, and so on. So these sacred places, then, which are associated with powerful men and to some extent women, these powerful men and women give a kind of protection to the place that allows for a freer expression of ideas and emotions and religious thought than you'll find sort of at the center. And of course in Morocco this is expressed in terms of the Bled Siba and the Bled al-Mahsen that you've seen, but we can think about a kind of religious equivalent, which is the area where the scholars are able to police the expression of religion, and areas in the hinterland where they can't, or areas that are protected from the establishment by the countervailing power of a religiously gifted person. So I refer to this as dialect Islam, and a dialect is no news to many of you, is a regional version of a language distinguished by vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. All language ultimately is dialect. Nobody speaks an English that is not local. Nobody speaks an Arabic that's not local. Nobody speaks Japanese that's not local. But prestige varieties tend to express class and education, but not location. Prestige varieties of language express class and education, but not location. So literally, I was told I was invited to a cocktail. The British are very concerned with, I mean, those of you who've been to England or Great Britain know that class is everywhere. There's the concern with class is sort of at the center of British conceptual and self-conceptual life. I was invited to a cocktail party for the faculty at Edinburgh University where I was. And I said, oh, that sounds like it'd be fun. And the person who was giving the cocktail party said, fun? I hardly think it's going to be fun. And I said, well, isn't it, have a few drinks, talk, get to know people. He said, the whole purpose of a drinks party is so that people relax to the extent that you can tell where they're really from and who they really are. And the way that you do that is by hearing, when they stop using what's called RP, received pronunciation, and they start using a regional accent, you know that what their class is and what their locale is. And so oh yes, well, yes, she of course teaches at Oxford, but she's really a grocer's daughter from, Manchester, that kind of thing. So language is about power, language is about placement, and as to repeat a cliche I used yesterday, the only difference between a dialect and a language is one has an army, right? One has powers of enforcement. So the BBC, which I hope some of you listen to both in English and in Arabic, is famous, or was famous, for enforcing the norms of received pronunciation, which were, that is to say, British and not Manchester or London or Liverpool or whatever. And to enforce this well into the 1960s, the men, and it was overwhelmingly men who appeared on the BBC, even if they were on the radio, had to wear a tuxedo, right? Evening dress, a tie, a long-tailed coat, a very formal dress, to remind them that they were to speak this artificial language, because a non-regional language is artificial. It's what nobody speaks. So dialect then reveals or is connected to class, occupation, gender, as well as locale. So when you listen to somebody speaking Moroccan, and not that I can do this, but you can tell what part of Morocco they're from. So even I can just listen to speech patterns and hear differences in women's speech and men's speech. Right? This seems to be, by the way, a kind of, both phonologically and otherwise, seems to be a universal in language. You can tell the kind of occupation the person has. Does this person talk like a professor, or do they talk like a banker, or do they talk like a tradesman, or a person who fixes sidewalks, or whatever? So all of these things are revealed in language, and as I say, the important thing to recognize is that we all speak dialect. Nobody speaks anything other than dialect. It's just my dialect. And my dialect changes in response to circumstances. So when I go, I grew up all over America, and one of the things that you learn to keep from getting beat up is not to sound like you're from away. And so when I'm in the South, I tend to go with more diphthongs, and my INGs then the word tend to drop off. So I'm going to the place, and it's not, I'm exaggerating it slightly, but the point is you soften the things that mark you as being from away. But in New Hampshire, where I'm now, you tend to talk from the front of your mouth, and if you go in and you're trying to get somebody to fix your yard, then you sort of adjust your accent somewhat so you don't stand out so much. So these are things that we do in speech to signify rank and power, but also things like who we're not. So when I'm at the university, supposedly, I'm trying to show that I belong to that class, that I belong to that occupation, that I have the appropriate gender, and that I this is who I am. And we criticize on the basis of somebody who doesn't belong for whatever reason. Certainly, when I was an undergraduate, it was unusual to have a woman in the university. And one of the things you noticed about women in the university, they spoke in a very masculinized way, much less pitch variation like this, right, which is associated with femininity. Even radio broadcasters now, if you listen to American public radio, they tend to talk in a sort of a lower register of voice and much less inflection. But dialect also has positive values. Dialect is the way that you create solidarity and identity and a zone of safety and comfort. And again, there are gender differences in all of this, but the point is that you signify that you belong by participating in this dialect usage. Okay, and again, dialects are where you have novelty and creativity and heightened expressiveness. So dialect Islam then is the forms of Islam that would evoke the "that's not Islam" or "that's not the Islam that I know" reaction. And we can see this when in travelogues, like my favorite is Ibn Battuta, when he goes to Egypt and he sees some practice of which he disapproves, not merely that it's new, but disapproves, he says that they're ignorant, they don't know what they're doing. And sometimes that's an alim who recites, his pronunciation of the Quran is bad, or his grammar is bad, but also it's sometimes ways in which God is being worshipped in ways that he disapproves of, right? And that's his response. This is not the Islam that I know. Now, he has coming from Morocco, he has, being a medieval, he has a fairly broad notion of religious creativity. So, for example, in Damascus, there's a ritual which Ibn Taymiyyah condemns and Ibn Battuta likes, right? And that is that they have the plague then, the Black Plague, that Black Death is coming through the Syria in these days. And to get God to spare them from the plague, there's a huge procession with Muslims and Christians and Jews, each carrying their holy book, and each, begging God in appropriate terms to spare them. They also are wearing their clothes inside out, their jacket inside out. Right? Now, Ibn Battuta thinks this is a great idea, and he really likes it, and he says this is, proof of the religiosity of the Syrians. Ibn Taymiyyah says that these practices are unacceptable bid'ah and shame on them, and they're also mixing with Christians and Jews, and that's really a terrible thing here. By the way, do you know why the clothes are inside out? Are you familiar with that? Anybody? No, in this case, why you wear your clothes inside out. Why do you wear your clothes inside out in Morocco? Exactly. So if you look in fiqh books, the istisqa prayer, the prayer for seeking water, is you wear your clothes inside out. So clearly what they've done in Syria is they've taken this notion that is, quote, Orthodox Islamic, and they've applied it to a new circumstance. This is religious creativity, right? Because it's a way of signifying how disordered things are and so on when you're not getting rain. In this case, how disordered things are when people are dying of the plague. I mean, comes through and 30% of your population is dead, boom, in a matter of a month. So, the reaction to these novel practices in some ways determines what's dialectical. In other words, if people coming from the outside go, that doesn't make sense to me, or I'm not familiar with that, that tells you that it's a dialect form of Islam. Again, I want to emphasize that our job when we see this is to refrain from judgment, that is to hold back on judgment and just to recognize and try and assess what the importance of this practice is. And this, again, the technical term, it comes from philosophy, is epoché. Now, dialect Islam, and this is the whole point, is the central feature of many people's religious life, right? again, the overwhelming majority of Muslims, even in Arab countries, do not know the Quran. They don't know the texts and the isnads and the technical features of hadith, right? They have ideas about Muhammad and how important he is. They have ideas of the Quran as a source of authority, but their religious expressiveness frequently comes through practices that are not canonical. They're not in fiqh books, right? These are the practices that are the source of emotional commitment and emotional expression. It's the locus also where marginal groups are incorporated into larger society. This is where ethnic groups like slaves or, what should I say, the wrong kind of ethnics. So in Turkic areas, for example, I don't know what to call them, but Arabs and Semites and so on and so forth are disprivileged or were disprivileged. And so this is the place where they can express their religiosity. And also, and this is important, Dialect Islam is where the boundaries between so-called religions, say Islam and Christianity or Islam and Judaism, Dialect Islam is where those boundaries are softest. So you frequently find that there are shared practices in the domain of Dialect Islam with Christians and Jews. So I came to Morocco one time and traveled around for about a month with a friend who's a professor of Jewish studies. And she wanted to see all the important sites of Jewish Morocco, which of course I knew nothing about. It was rather an amazing trip, and it was before so much of the Jewish identity of Morocco had disappeared. And one of the places we went to was a saint's tomb, right? Rabbi Amran up in Wazan, not far from the town of Lausanne. And it's an amazingly powerful place. And it's a site where Jews from all over the world come, on his death day to venerate him and ask for miracles and so on and so forth. But also a lot of Muslims come, and a lot of Muslims in the past tons of Muslims came in the past. So we got a taxi driver to go up to this place. And I said, we're going, do you know where it is? Yes. Well, have you been there? Well, yes, my wife and I went for I can't remember what he said, the Lila or something like that. In Hebrew, I guess the word is Haylula or something. And I said, just sort of casually, it's like, well, so, you're a Muslim and this guy was Jewish. Why are you going to a Jewish saint's tomb? And the response was, well, they say he was Jew, but that's just because he died in the Jewish quarter. He actually was a Muslim. Well, we have a good idea of who this guy was. He actually came to Morocco to collect money. He was from Hebron and was a rabbi. So he was actually Jewish. But the point is that this Muslim participated in the rituals around Rabbi Amran. At the back of his mind was the idea that he was really a Muslim. And the reason for that is, of course, because he was believed to be powerful. Right? And look, if you're really sick and the only physician is the wrong religion, you're going to go to the doctor anyway, right? So in this case, you need something, you go to Rabbi Amran. The same is true of Muslim saints. Jews participated in the cult of saints in Morocco to a surprising extent. In other areas, in the Balkans, for example, literally you can't tell to which tradition this saint belongs. He could be a Christian, he could be a Muslim, both claim him, nobody cares. Right? This is just a way, and again, the analogy to dialect is, professors really care if the words they use are truly Arabic or truly proper English. But at the level of the man in the street, they're perfectly willing to use French or Arabic or Indonesian or whatever. And so all of these words that enrich English ultimately begin as dialect and slang and regional forms of English. So the Dialect Islam is particularly the domain of women, again, of ethnic groups that are excluded, of the poor, of the non-literate, and all of that. Now, I want to just think briefly about the concept of saints and sainthood because they're associated particularly with Dialect Islam. I want to emphasize that so-called mainstream, or what I'm going to call official cosmopolitan Islam, also recognize saints. The concept of a saint is not, of a wali, is not a controversial notion in the pre-modern period. Really, it's only in the 20th century or late 19th century that it begins to be an issue, for reasons that we'll talk about briefly. But the friends of God are basically heroes, or we might think of them as athletes, right? Think of some great football player. I must say, being an American, I'm an idiot about soccer and the football that the rest of the world does. But think about somebody who's really an amazing person. They're a hero to people in a certain way. Why? Boys have posters in their bedrooms. Why? Right? And how does one think about this person? Is it that they're an athlete because they're touched by God and so they're a wonderful soccer player, football player? Or is it because they've worked really hard to become this amazing football player? Well, walis are like that, right? To some extent, they get their talent, their charisma from God. It's a gift from God. But also they're people who've disciplined themselves, who've mortified themselves, who live a modest life, who try and live a virtuous life. And that's what a saint is, and it makes them heroic. So the way that this person becomes heroic is called literally a tariqah, which is a technology of the self, a training method, right? How do I improve my speed as a runner? Or, you know, Morocco's had all of these wonderful Olympic athletes. Morocco's one of the few Arab countries where you see tons of people out in the morning running, right? Because of these models. Why? Well, you're learning to be a runner, right? You're learning a methodology of the self. That's the body in this case. But in the case, of saints, you're learning the way in which you cultivate the self, right? You learn to restrain your passions, your gluttony, your lust, right? And you do that in ways that you're taught by a saint, and that's what the tariqah, first and foremost, is. It's the technology. Results aren't guaranteed, however, right? You need to be lucky or blessed or something like that. You can improve yourself always, but the truth is, I can think about basketball here for a moment. I can train all I want. I'm not going to be Michael Jordan, right? There are limits to what I can accomplish, but I can become a better basketball player by training. It's the same religiously. You become a better Muslim by training on the tariqah. It's not guaranteed that you'll achieve the rank of sainthood. Now, Moroccan saints and sainthood, again, are distinctive. There are features about sainthood in Morocco that are different from sainthood in other countries, or other regions, rather, I should say. So first of all, I mentioned the anonymous saints. That's an important fact here that I think is notable, that expresses how important power is, the ability to do things is for saints. But unlike in really any place else I know, sainthood in this country or in this region is associated with a Sharifan genealogy. It's essential that you be descended from the Prophet, either from Al-Hassan or from Al-Hussein. I believe the most common thing here is Al-Hassan? Really? I would have thought it was Al-Hussein. No, it's Al-Hassan, okay. But here, again, it's linked to rulership as well, right? That certainly since the middle of the medieval period, since the 1400s or so, being a sharif is also important to be a ruler. And so the two kind of overlap and they kind of compete. So saints, kings, right? These are all working with and against and in competition with each other. And I speak here religiously. Now, part of the way in which this new theory of governance is constructed is by grounding it not just in genealogy, but also in, and we'll talk more about this on the last day, but is linking it to Islamic law. So it is asserted that the Malikis believe that the kings should be involved in rulership, in defining religious traditions. And that's true for the Malikis in North Africa in the period after, I don't know, 1350 or something like that. But if you look in earlier Maliki works and Maliki works from the East, there's no discussion of, or very little discussion of the link between the role for the king or the ruler, the sultan, whatever, or the khalifa, in determining Maliki jurisprudence. So that is a distinctive feature of Moroccan Islam, or North African Islam anyway. Now, I want to say that from a very early period, certainly the 900s, there is a porous boundary between the concept of the saint and dialect Islam. And saints, from an early period, certainly we have lots of texts from the 900s already that are critical of saints because they are too eager participants in dialect Islam. So Ibn al-Jawzi, yes, he writes a book about what is a saint, but he also writes Talbis Iblis, which is a critique of practices by followers of saints that are not justified, he thinks, religiously. This theme that saints are prone to contamination by dialect Islam then leads to the 19th and 20th century struggle by Muslim reformers against saintship, and the claim, which dates at least to the 18th century, that saintship has literally no place in Islam. So now there are polls, I'm familiar with Egypt particularly, but I've seen for several countries, most educated Muslims disapprove of tasawwuf, right? I suspect that's not true in Morocco, but it's true in most Muslim countries. At the same time, the same polls show that they don't even know what Sufism is. You say, okay, fine, so you disapprove of Sufism, what is Sufism? And they'll say, miracle-working saints, worshiping graves, all of that stuff. But the whole richness of Sufism, the elaborate literature, the complex spiritual practices, the poetry, all of this, most people, it's just disappeared from Islamic life in the contemporary world. Again, Morocco is exceptional in that respect. So then you get the conflation of tasawwuf, irfan, and zuhud, which are all practices. Ibn Hanbal, for example, was a famous zahid, right? With miracles, magic, and business, frankly, with, you know, charging money to help somebody have a child, or with collecting waqf lands so that you're a powerful landlord. And the descendants, particularly of saints, become powerful in a secular sense, we can say. The state, then, in the late modern period, the early modern period, begins to see Sufism as competition, and particularly Tariqa Sufism. The modern state, and we can see this most clearly in Turkey, says simply that tariqas are subversive organizations. They're the potential for revolution, and they're banned. Right? Now that's an extreme response, but most Muslim states have at one point or another stepped down on Sufism, in part because of the fear that it's a center for subversion. Now this is not just competition, however. It's also because the modern state is concerned with the welfare of its citizens. And in every country I know, there are attacks on miracle-working Sufis, on the fact that people, when they get malaria, in Istanbul, for example, in the 19th century, if you got malaria, you went to the Moroccan, because Moroccan magicians, or Moroccans had the monopoly on magicians in Istanbul, and you went, if you had malaria, you went to the Moroccan, and he tied threads around you to keep you from, dying from malaria, right? And the state, which is concerned with welfare, no, says go see a doctor, right? You want to have children, don't go to a saint, go to an obstetrician, right? if you have cancer, go see an oncologist. And this, it seems to me, most of us would recognize it as a legitimate concern of the modern state. But there's also simply intellectuals' disdain for superstition, right? Superstitio literally means too much attachment, right? It's overdoing it. And so these practices are defined in the modern world, in every religious tradition I know, as superstition, something to be suppressed. So there are a whole series of forces that are arrayed against dialect Islam. The first is, of course, in the modern world, particularly the universalist thrust of Islam in the newly connected Ummah. So stuff that Egyptians don't recognize that's in Morocco can't be good. Stuff that's in Egypt that Arabians don't recognize can't be good, and so on. So there's a desire to homogenize Islam, and the argument that Tawheed requires a homogeneity of Islamic practice around the world. There's also, I think, a mistrust of manifested religiosity, of spontaneous emotion, and so on. So modern states don't like people going crazy, and they want to put it in places that they can contain it, like football stadiums, like concerts, right? Instead of in places that they can't contain it, like churches or saints' tombs or whatever. Modern religion tends to be privatized. We think of religion as something that you have, that you do by yourself, that's about your interior life, not about something that you do publicly, and that leads to emotional expression. Of course, there are also more powerful and rational sources of remedy in the modern world, right? You can go to a doctor and so on and so forth. There's medicine, there's psychiatry, and so on. But dialect Islam is nonetheless an important part of pre-modern Islam, and I would argue of modern Islam in ways we don't quite recognize yet. Dialect Islam is where religious creativity, should be creativity, arises. Right? This is Durkheim's argument that the religious person has to return to the effervescence of religion in order to continue to be refreshed in his day-to-day practice of religion. Now, what does this mean? What is the source of collective effervescence in contemporary Islam? It could be, for example, the Eid prayers, right? Although the idea that you have a masalla where everybody in Fez goes and prays is dying out. The masalla in Fez, the last time I was there, was basically where you went to get heroin, right? It was neglected. The rumor was it was going to be sold for a hotel site, right? Is there a masalla in Arbat where theoretically everybody in Rabat goes and prays on the Eid? Sorry? In Saleh there is one. Fez has one. Have they recovered that one, or is there a new one?
I think Sahed Hassan, yeah. La Place del Hassan qui est Rabat, there is one.
There, okay.
There's one in every neighborhood. I mean, there's a mosque, and then there's the thing, and then there's this.
Right, but the point is that that in the pre-modern period there were these places where the entire populace knew to go. We didn't have to ask where it was, and everybody's like, oh, there isn't. Well, exactly, but the point is it used to be that it was for the entire town, that there was this huge mass of people that people were not used to seeing, and that is where you get the collective effervescence, that sense of everybody doing something, like everybody watching a football game, right? And that seems to me is less the case for contemporary Islam. You may pray in a big mosque, but it's still, at most a few thousand people, right? Whereas in the Eidain, you would have, everybody, right? And that it tends to be lost. It's also the locus for many people with their engagement with Islam altogether. Salat, yes, we may do that, and so on and so forth, or maybe not. But we definitely celebrate the day that the saint died, right? Or the date that the son of a saint is initiated and he becomes the head of the order. In Islam in particular, it's often the only site of emotional expressiveness. One of the features of Islam that's very interesting to me, it's a form of asceticism, it's an ascetical religion, and that's about personal self-discipline and containment. So it's in dialect Islam that you find emotional expressiveness, right? If somebody, passes out and, and so on, in Friday prayers, that person will be sort of taken away. There's something wrong with that person. So the question is then, in the modern world, what has been displaced dialect Islam in the modern, where do we find dialect Islam in the modern world? And this is a difficult thing for me to determine. It seems to me one place is popular preachers, that people choose preachers and then they watch on YouTube or they get videos of, or whatever, particular preachers. And there seems to be still the idea that people in Egypt particularly like this guy. But as society becomes fragmented and locale becomes a feature of occupation and so on, you can say perhaps that biologists or people in the sciences tend to be attracted to this speaker and not that speaker. But there are other sites as well, which I haven't figured out yet. But there are these displacements of identity, and we can argue, and I do in the book, that one way of looking at groups like ISIS and Qaeda and so on is that they are a dialect of Islam themselves, that they're a non-mainstream, often religiously deviant group in which people find emotional expressiveness and a profound relevance to the circumstances in which they find themselves. So, I want to leave you with the notion that just as speaking like a farmer from, I don't know where, some village outside of Marrakesh is looked down on by people in the university or by wealthy people in Rabat, so too a number of religious practices are looked down upon by the, the religious elites. And they're, in many cases, as in the case of my wife, looking at the arm of St. Catherine, there are lots of reasons for, taking that out. But we need to recognize that nonetheless, for many people, and particularly for non-elites, that dialectical expression is where their Islam, attachment to Islam, where their religious life is actually lived out vibrantly. Right? Not everybody's an intellectual. Right? And the question is, how do they live their life religiously apart from the kind of scholarship that we think of as characteristic of Islam? So now in Great Britain, for example, it's now fashionable to speak regionally, to have an accent. And if you listen to the BBC, and older people are freaked out by this, but you can really tell where the person is from. Some cases, they have a distinctively African, Nigerian English accent on the BBC. People are killing themselves over this. But it may be the case that over time, the regional expressions of Islam, it'll be perfectly fashionable, perfectly acceptable to say, yes, well, here in Morocco we do this. And there are cases of that, for example, in marriage that don't seem to trouble anybody particularly, that marriage rituals are distinctive to this place or that place. But that remains to be seen. That's into the future. All I want to say is that we need to take this seriously, and it's not something that is just, right? But it's something that is an important part of understanding Islam in some particular place, in some particular time, and in general. Okay? So I think this will be a good topic for you guys to break down into groups and discuss. I look forward very much to your reports. I'm sure we all have examples of dialect religion that we've encountered, and so that will be something to bring back to the table when we reassemble. Okay?
Before we split, is there any particular question or any particular remark somebody would like to make? Any thoughts?
General remarks, criticisms, observations.
Okay. If you don't mind, I'll just start very quickly. You have to see the movie, Le Saint Inconnu, The Unknown Saint. Have you anybody seen it? The Unknown Saint. It's a Moroccan movie. Aladdin El-Jam, the director. It's a wonderful movie. It was on Netflix. It has won many awards around the world. It's a Moroccan movie made in Morocco by